Our media landscape is dominated by a few big players, almost all of which are owned by big Eastern and foreign corporate interests, or by the government itself. As taxpayers, we're forced to pay billions of dollars every year to support the liberal CPC. But now even the non-government-owned mainstream media are on the take, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars a year in a massive taxpayer bailout from the federal government. This means that even those few bright spots of independence and free thinking in the mainstream media are now on the government dole and cannot speak without fear that the government could pull their funding at any time. There are a few great journalists in the non-government-owned media, but they mostly work for large corporate interests owned and operated out of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and New York. Western voices, voices that speak for the West without fear of what their bosses in Toronto will say, are far and few between. The West needs a strong and independent voice that is willing to take on the issues facing our people. This is why we refounded the Western Standard in 2019. Since then, the Western Standard has burst onto the scene and shaken up Western Canada's media landscape. With a growing and dedicated team of reporters and opinion columnists, we have quickly become the third most read online news platform in Western Canada, with an average of 3 million readers per month and hundreds of thousands of people watching our videos and listening to our podcasts. Our news team is made up of credible reporters, largely recruited from the mainstream media, but who focus on issues that are all too often ignored by the old players. Our opinion columnists fearlessly take on controversial issues that most of the old players are too afraid to touch directly. The Western Standard's mission is to be the independent voice of the New West.
This is why we need to see the receipts. What did you actually spend the money on?
We got some major news breaking at the moment for you.
We're making a big difference and giving Westerners a homegrown alternative to the big, government-owned and government-funded mainstream media. We're changing the conversation.
Now, obviously, I condemn those symbols. I think those are...
For sure, we all do at the Western Standard.
What are your thoughts on that debate?
I think that Tom Clark, the moderator, certainly lost.
There's issues with the current ambulance system run by the province.
We refuse to accept a penny of the big media bailout that has corrupted Canada's once free press. Because we are one of the only genuinely independent media in Canada, we are able to speak freely and cannot be cancelled by Ottawa. We have a large and growing team of journalists with bureaus in Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Regina, and on Parliament Hill. Our reporters and columnists are fearless and work tirelessly to give you straight news and cut through the spin. That is why we need you, the reader, to step up and become a member of the Western Standard. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10. Thank you for joining us at the Western Standard's Conservative Party of Canada leadership, sort of kind of revised format, not really a debate. Several months ago, we invited all of the eligible candidates for the Federal Conservative Party's leadership election to join us during the Calgary Stampede for a debate that would focus on Western issues. The West makes up 4 out of 6 Canadian provinces, drives the Canadian economy, and largely pays the bills around here and out there, but receives a disproportionately small focus of federal political attention, or more accurately, a small positive focus of federal attention. The 8 most terrifying words to a Westerner, and especially an Albertan, is, "I'm from Ottawa and I'm here to help." Our discussion today will focus on key themes and questions directly related to Westerners specifically, and federal issues of concern to all Canadians, but that are of particular importance to many Westerners. As I noted, all eligible candidates for the leadership were invited to debate here in Calgary. 4 of the 6 candidates, Jean Charest, Patrick Brown, Roman Baber, and Scott Aitchison, accepted. 2 candidates, Pierre Poilievre and Leslyn Lewis, have unfortunately declined. And on Wednesday, the Conservative Party's Leadership Election Organizing Committee disqualified Patrick Brown. I have no real opinion on that, other than that it'll make for a less lively debate. With that, we've made a last-minute decision to revise the format of today's event, from that of a cut-and-thrust debate to that of a fireside chat. I was personally looking forward to seeing some Stampede-style bull wrestling on stage today,
But with 3 of the 5 candidates participating, there were requests from some campaigns to change the format to that of a fireside chat. So for the record, I'm obliged to note that Roman Baber was less than pleased with this change since he already brought his lasso. In place of the debate, I'm going to sit down with Mr. Aitchison, Mr. Baber, and Mr. Charest, who I'll recall just the ABC, for a one-on-one discussion about why Westerners should consider them as a leader and as a prime minister that would have the best interests of the West at heart. I personally want to thank Mr. Scott Aitchison, Mr. Roman Baber, Mr. Jean Charest for having the guts and courtesy to join us here today in what most would probably call the beating heart of Canadian conservatism. Every politician in Canada shows up to the Calgary Stampede looking for votes. It's aptly been called a petting zoo for politicians. But Westerners deserve more than politicians who simply come on a plane, strap on a buckle, and don a hat. They deserve leaders that are willing to look them in the eyes and explain why they should be trusted with the loaded ammunition of democracy, your vote. With that, I'm going to introduce our first candidate today. The Honorable Jean Charest was born in Sherbrooke, Quebec. He was first elected to the House of Commons in 1984 as a Progressive Conservative. 2 years later, at the age of just 28, Mr. Charest became the youngest minister in Canadian history. And speaking of 2, when the Progressive Conservatives under Kim Campbell were reduced to 2 seats in 1993, Mr. Charest was one of only 2 survivors. He went on to become the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party before running to become the Premier of Quebec, an office which he served in from 2003 until 2012. Since then, he has been in the private sector until making his re-entry into politics for this very race. So please join me in welcoming to the stage the Honorable Mr. Jean Charest.
There we go. There we go. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.
Right over here. Okay. Yeah. Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
Well, thank you for joining us. You launched your campaign in Calgary here. You actually did a good place, the Wild Rose Brewery. As a Wild Roser, I appreciated the tribute. You launched your campaign in Calgary, and just yesterday on Triggered with Corey Morgan, a Western Standard show, you announced an equalization policy. And I'm going to ask you another question on equalization. So,
okay.
But maybe a broader question here. There's been a lot of conflict between Alberta and Quebec for a long time, and it's at least perceived probably to be at a greater level now than it has been in a very long time. Is my microphone off?
We hear you well.
Can you guys hear? There we go. You've served as the Premier of Quebec. Thank you. Here to serve. You've served as the Premier of Quebec, and you served in the Mulroney government. But you know, the Mulroney government kind of ended badly as the National Conservative Coalition fragmented very much along regional lines. Why should Westerners trust you as coming from Quebec, and you have to defend the interests of your province when you're the Premier, but why should Albertans look to you to have their best interests at heart?
Now, Derek, and thank you first of all for the invitation and for pointing out that I think we accepted spontaneously, Roman and Scott and I, this invitation to be with you today. And I'm delighted to join you and to share some thoughts about this leadership race and to do it here in Alberta and Western Canada. Let me start by saying that, yes, I talked and I'm proposing an Alberta Accord, and there's a reason for that, and the reason why I chose to come to Calgary on the very first day of my campaign. I'm very much running as someone who has a very deeply held belief in Canada. And that belief includes the reality and the fact that if we want this country to succeed, Alberta has to be at the very heart of what we do. It can't be on the sidelines. And what I wanted to do early on in the campaign is acknowledge the fact that a lot of Albertans today feel left out. They feel they've been set aside, that they're not recognized, that the rest of the country, not just the federal government, but the rest of the country has not acknowledged the fact that Alberta has gone through a very tough time. And yet when Alberta is prosperous and doing well, the rest of the country is very happy to share the wealth with Alberta, with the rest of with all of Canada. And when times are not as good, well, all of a sudden, it's as though Albertan doesn't count anymore. And it's one of the reasons why I'm in this race, Derek, because I know from the experience I've had, and as someone who believes very deeply in Canada, that the only way this country can succeed is if Alberta's at the table and participating in shaping the agenda of the country and its policies. It's what I believe in. And it's been the common thread of my whole political life. And so I'm here to say that not only do I think that's the case, but I also think it's important that we put it into policies. And I understand the anger and the disappointment. But the real question in a leadership race and for a leader is, what do you do after? What happens? What do you do if people are disappointed and they feel that anger? How do we translate that into something that is going to be substantive and real and change things? And that's what I want to do in this leadership race. And that's why I've proposed an Alberta Accord, starting with Alberta for all of Western Canada, but Alberta as the center and the focus of how we need to change the country, starting with Alberta.
So when I want to talk about what that looks like, I mean, I don't have to remind anyone here, yourself or anyone attending. Is my microphone cutting out again? It's good? Okay.
That's okay. I can do the talking.
I was only ever in an opposition as a politician. I was so I only ever got to ask questions, not answer them. Alberta and to a lesser extent BC and Saskatchewan have paid a ton into equalization. Alberta pays into equalization. Even when we're going through a bust, not just in the booms. We got a boom right now. We'll probably screw it up again, but we do it even in busts. And at the same time, I think Albertans feel punished because despite the contribution of Alberta and the West more broadly, the federal government and some provinces go out of their way to hem us in from fully developing the resources that pay the bills nationally. So you put forward the idea of this Alberta Accord on the Corey Morgan show, and this is going to involve equalization. Why don't you flesh out a bit more what I understand there's negotiation in these things, and it would be between you and premiers, Council of the Federation, but what would you see as a starting place for what this might look like?
Well, I become leader of the party and we're successful in forming a national government, and forming a national government also means including Alberta. In the first 30 days after my election, I would meet with the Premier of Alberta to start the process of defining what is going to be an Alberta Accord. And in the first 6 months of my mandate, I'd also meet with the provinces through the Council of the Federation that I was part of creating in 2003, the chair, a meeting that, by the way, would be co-chaired by whoever is the chair of the Council of the Federation and the Prime Minister. And that's not a matter of detail. We live in a federal system of government, ladies and gentlemen. Canadians tend to forget that. Certainly Ottawa does. They don't seem to be aware. In this federal system of government of ours, which is very decentralized, it is the provinces that run this country on a day-to-day basis. I know, I've been there. I've been on both sides. Education, health, I mean, you name it. And so we need to acknowledge that. And the provinces are not a sub-level in a federation of the federal government. They each work within their areas of jurisdiction. And so within the 6 months, the idea behind that, Derek, would be I would sit down to shape the agenda with the provinces. And then within the year, I would conclude an agreement, an Alberta Accord, that would be the lead province for all of Western Canada. It's not just about Alberta. It's also, as you mentioned, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and British Columbia, who may not see itself as part of Western Canada. And the idea here is to conclude an agreement on a few subjects. First, equalization. Making equalization fair for Alberta, which means that if you pay into equalization and when things are not as well, then you're not penalized for it. And that equalization has to be understood throughout the country as being an extraordinary contribution by those who have the good fortune of having an economy that's doing well, but other provinces have a responsibility also in regards to receiving equalization. The second issue would be, I would be inspired by the Fair Deal panel, is pensions. Quebec has a Quebec pension fund. They've done it since the 1960s. I think Alberta should have its share of the Canadian pension fund that goes to Albertans and do like Quebec has and run that own pension fund. By the way, I was in the House of Commons in the 1990s when the CPPIB was created. We had a debate at the time, very few people know this, about creating more than one fund instead of the mega CPPIB. Why? There were two reasons. One, to de-risk. If there were more than one fund, you wouldn't put all the eggs in the same basket. And two, to create more competition. Makes sense. Now, this is significant for Alberta because if Alberta is running its own pension fund, this is a very powerful economic tool for Alberta, one you do not have now. You have the Alberta Investment Board, but this would be a very powerful tool. So the third, I know I'm taking a lot of time, but the third one's immigration. Quebec has a specific deal on immigration. Alberta should have the same deal. If it's good for Quebec, it should be good for Alberta. And what would this allow you to do that you're not able to do now? Choose the immigrants that you want to bring in according to your priorities in the labor market, for example. The other area is a police force. If you wish and that have an Alberta provincial police, that's fine. That's your decision. And as the federal prime minister who are responsible for the RCMP, I would facilitate that. And the fifth area would be trade, non-trade. So that would be the beginning of the Alberta Accord, a fresh start for Canada in regards to how we deal with Alberta and we deal with all of the country.
So anyone who watches The Pipeline will know I get very impressed with my ability to segue, and I'm equally impressed with myself right now. Alberta's going through a not so quiet revolution right now. In the 1960s and early 70s, Quebec started to assert itself as Quebec Nation or what have you, and to take back control. See this great segue? We had the Firewall Letter of 2001 signed by Stephen Harper and other largely academics and some other people in the business community in Calgary. We had the Fair Deal Panel in 2020. And I think, so the direction continues to get more aggressive in terms of what a lot of, at least a large segment of Alberta is demanding. And Saskatchewan is, I think, coming along on some of these things. One of the major candidates for the leadership of the United Conservative Party of Alberta, Danielle Smith, has proposed something she calls the Alberta Sovereignty Act. I'm not sure how much you know about it, but this would more or less be an act that allows the legislature to declare certain federal legislation will just not be enforced in Alberta. It'll be on the books, but just will not be enforced. Other provinces have experimented with things like this in the past, just not quite so brashly enshrined it in legislation, but there were things like that with drug policy in British Columbia over time, and Quebec has done it to one degree or another. If the Alberta Sovereignty Act passes and you were elected prime minister, how would you react to it?
Well, and what you're describing in your introduction, by the way, is a move towards more autonomy of the provinces. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way, folks. I mean, again, Canada is one of the most decentralized federations in the world. The only other country that is more decentralized than Canada, and I hope there's no one from Belgium here, is Belgium, and no one understands how Belgium operates. And their best period is when they had no government for a year and a half. But Canada, and also one of the features of Canadian federalism, contrary to other federations, is that the provinces are responsible for natural resources. That's an exception more than a rule. And so there's nothing wrong, Derek, with provinces assuming more autonomy. And the idea is that the federal government's job is to coordinate this to make it work. The federal government will continue to have very real powers. One of them is called the federal spending power, which is extremely important and gives them the ability to do a whole number of things. But we are stronger when provinces are strong.
Okay, so I know you've spoken a lot about autonomy and provinces taking control over their areas in provincial jurisdiction, but I mean to press on this, this specifically, the idea of not enforcing certain federal legislation on the provincial level.
Well, it depends. Let's try to give it an example. Let's take the environment, for example. We could very well coordinate environmental processes so that whatever the provincial environmental process is, it is value for what the federal environment process is. You understand what? And I've seen that done before. You say, instead of doing two environmental processes, we're going to do one. Or there will be the provincial environmental process that the federal government recognizes as being the equivalent of what the federal government would do. That is the kind of intelligent thing you do in a federation that works. I understand, by the way, very well what Danielle Smith is saying in regards to how we operate our federation. And that's why one of the reasons why I'm running, by the way, and why I think I would be for this job the right person, is that I actually think it'd be a breath of fresh air in Ottawa to have someone as prime minister who's been the premier of a province and who actually understands how the country operates. And what I'm going to say may surprise a lot of people. I've been on both sides. But you know what? There's a lot of people in Ottawa who don't know how this country operates. They don't have a clue. And it's a bubble. And it is a bubble. I've experienced it. And I remember being premier and saying to my colleagues, I only wish the feds would be as federalist as I was federalist. And let's say, I'll give you an example. Mr. Trudeau comes out of the campaign. He delivers a budget, does a deal with Mr. Singh. They're back on spending when actually we should be reining in spending. And then with Mr. Singh, he makes a deal where he says this. He says, we're going to try to do an agreement on pharmacare and dental care. Ladies and gentlemen, that is provincial jurisdiction, A. B, can I tell you something? When they come to the table, Derek, and say to the provinces, we want to do a deal on pharmacare and we'll co-fund it, I guarantee you the answer will be, we have seen this movie before. And as soon as there's a downturn in the economy, you guys are going to walk away from funding and we'll be left holding the program. It's not going to happen. And what does that say about that government? They don't get it. They don't understand how it works. Well, I think it'd be good to have a prime minister who does and who's been there.
Okay. Well, thank you.
By the way, I've never thought in my lifetime I'd have Jay Hill and his wife Leah applaud me so much. I may run you as a candidate in my campaign.
My reporters have just taken notes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Don't record
that. Since 2020, the federal government, the provinces have engaged in, we're switching gears a bit here. The federal government, the provinces have engaged in a very large suite of restrictions involving COVID. Lockdowns, mandatory masking, mandatory vaccines. This, in many respects, has created a breach. This has been particularly difficult for conservative leaders to handle, I think, as the libertarian portion, for lack of a better term, within the Conservative coalition, I think has become probably a larger segment than it has been maybe in the past. And it's created a breach with those kinds of voters. It has arguably taken down the last Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole. It, I think, very arguably took down the Premier of Alberta. We're having two leadership races here. You've been critical of Mr. Poilievre and Mr. Baber's support of the Freedom Convoy. And I know that you've said you want to get rid of the remaining federal mandates. I think absolutely everybody does. But I want to know if you believe that at least the federal mandates, and I know the provincial ones are a whole other kettle of fish here, but the federal mandates, do you believe that they were ever justified at any point in the last 2.5 years?
You mentioned Roman, and I want to say something about Roman. And I didn't know him very well before this leadership race, but I know enough about Roman to say this. Roman stood on a question of principle and sacrificed a lot to stand on those principles. And I want to recognize that, because that is something that doesn't happen very often and is admirable and says something about character. And he wasn't the last one to arrive at this, by the way. He didn't follow the parade. He was ahead of it, and he paid a price for that. Now, on this issue, which is always a very difficult issue, I think the federal government, I can't follow what their positions are now. I think as we all started on this COVID episode, no one had a playbook on how you do it. And I think we all cut slack for everyone, including whether it's Kenny, Ford, whether it's Legault in Quebec, or everyone. We're trying to figure out what is this and how do we deal with it and how do we protect people. One thing stands out in my experience and the Canadian experience relative to the rest of the world. It's our inability to treat people in hospitals, what we call our capacity. And that's what the main difference was between Canada and the United States. We did not have the hospital capacity to actually treat people. And that's something that speaks to a very urgent problem in the country. Our healthcare system was broken before COVID, and it's been made worse. I would, as a prime minister, do something that some people think is attacking a sacred cow, especially federal liberals. I would table a new Canada Health Act. I would allow the provinces to innovate. I'd untie their hands and allow them to bring in private sector care and remaining with a single payer so that we have a healthcare system to deliver services. And why? So that we not have lockdowns. So that we have a healthcare system that has the ability to absorb people who are sick, whether it's COVID or anything else. Now, right now, the confusion is, and the federal government, we have to admit, is broken right now. Can't deliver passports. Airports are a mess. The immigration department has a huge backlog. Michelle and I, my wife is with me. We traveled over here. She's on me every day. Put the mask on. Take the mask off at the airport. We walk through the desk. No mask. We go for security, have a mask. Take off security, take the mask off. Put it back on. Get on the plane, put on the mask. I mean, and that's all federal. I mean, it's total confusion. It doesn't make sense. In the meantime, everywhere else here in Alberta and in Quebec and everywhere else, you don't wear a mask. I get it. I mean, the federal government, I don't know what game they're playing with this, but it doesn't make sense. And on this issue, now we're going to go through different waves. I think we're not going to go back into lockdowns, but please, let's have the courage and wherewithal to fix our healthcare system so that we don't have to contemplate the worst of solutions to deal with an epidemic.
So I appreciate your answer around healthcare reform. That would obviously be a monumental change.
Yes.
And ICU capacity was one of the big distinguishing factors. I don't want to get my numbers wrong, but little Montana, with about a quarter of our population just south of us, had the same ICU capacity as Alberta.
Exactly.
And that should say something. And that obviously means we have a greater stress on our system than the Americans had, and that would contribute to things like lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine mandates. But I have to press. So within the lockdowns were pretty much provincial, but vaccine mandates were federal and provincial. When they brought in vaccine mandates, I suppose September last year, I'm sure it had nothing to do with election timing, but
not much, no.
Yeah, do you believe that there was ever any justification for federal vaccine mandates for, say, federal workers or travel?
There was a lot of reasons to encourage people to get vaccinated. I got vaccinated, by the way. 3 times I got vaccinated. And I got COVID, by the way. It didn't stop me from getting COVID. But let me share an experience that gives you my perspective on it. In the province of Quebec, Legault gets this idea that everyone in the healthcare system has to be vaccinated. Everyone, no exceptions. And then they go out there and every week they pound it. We have until, I think it was the 15th of November. Not vaccinated, you're going to be fired. Well, guess what? They backed off because there were going to be 15,000 people in that system who were walking away from their jobs. And then they said, well, you know what? We can't afford to let them go. Now, truckers, who were the heroes of the COVID period and celebrated, and rightfully so. Rightfully so. I mean, they're the ones carrying goods, and all of a sudden we discovered how valuable those who in our economy were either on trucking or working in shops or other words were. And then he comes in with this rule. Well, I don't think it works. So and looking into the future, Derek, I don't see how you can impose it on everyone, because it's just not going to work, and we're going to hamper our ability to deal. There's other ways of working around it and making sure that we do as much as we can so that people have the ability to choose to protect their health and protect those around them.
Okay. So I've got the 5-minute warning on our chat here.
Okay.
So what I'm going to try and be brief, and if you can too, I'm going to try and get 2 questions. We're going to This is the lightning round.
I heard your warning.
All right. This question is a little self-interested, maybe a lot. In addition to the CBC, the federal government now directly subsidizes virtually the entire media, all the legacy media, and even a lot of the independent media. This means that independents like the Western Standard and some of the other independents here today, we're subsidizing massive, even multinational corporations that are media corporations with our corporate income taxes. And even more concerning, it means that the federal government now is in essentially the media licensing business. We went through it for fun just to see what would happen, and it was positively Orwellian. We also got the Online News Act coming, which would force social media giants to give preferential ranking and feeds to government-approved media. If you're elected prime minister, where would you stand on the media bailouts and the Online News Act? Would those be pieces of legislation you'd be prepared to do away with?
And congratulations, you do not receive any federal government money.
No.
And your subscribers are the ones who support what you do. And
we're stuck with them, yeah.
Well, and they're stuck with you. And so it's a two-way street, Derek. And so that's what I believe in. And I, as a conservative and someone who believes in the freedom of the press, I find it very difficult to accept that the federal government is funding. And can you actually look at a society in which the federal government's funding the press and the press is independent? They can say they're independent as much as they can and keep a distance. I find it difficult to accept that. So I would not fund the press. I don't think that's acceptable. And I'm here, by the way, I'm here with Western Standard because I also believe in the independent press.
Well, thank you. In 2020, the federal Liberals used a cabinet, an order in council to ban about 1,500 different firearms that they claim were military or assault-style rifles. This include some anti-tank missiles that I didn't know weren't banned until now. I really wish I would have known. I got my hands on some Russian anti-aircraft missiles. You don't know what we get up to in Alberta. But many of these were just otherwise normal hunting and sport shooting rifles, but largely just that had an appearance that looks scary to the uninitiated. But you said several months ago you would not change any firearms legislation. Since then, but since your announcement, the Liberals have also said they're going to bring in a bill to ban the sale of handguns. Does this mean you would not reverse the ban on what the so-called military or assault style? If you could maybe clear that up and tell us, where do you stand on the changes between the Liberals on the 1,500 guns and then the handgun changes they say they're going to make? You're Prime Minister. What are you going to do on those two fronts?
Well, let me touch the essential points. The issue on guns in Canada is illegal handguns in cities. That's the issue today in this country. We have a home in Montreal. There's not a day, literally not a day where there isn't a shooting in plain daylight. I mean, people are shocked by that. That's what the federal government needs to deal with and make sure that we stop the illegal commerce of these illegal handguns coming in. Number two, this OIC should be revised by experts who are independent from the government and politics and really define what it is that they call an assault and weapons. And you know what? We're going to end up with a much smaller list than what we have in terms of the federal government's baiting.
So the anti-aircraft missiles stay banned.
We'll have to see. The experts will pronounce on that. Mm-hmm. By the way, just an anecdote of that. The 97 campaign, some of you may remember, Jean Charest made a statement. He was running for as Liberal Prime Minister that we had to stop children having nuclear weapons in the basement of their families' homes. I mean, it was, and then the third thing I would add about all of this is something for conservatives. Every time we get an election campaign, the Liberals bait us on handguns every time. And you know what? Every time we take the bait. I'm going to run as a leader of a party and in the next campaign on my agenda for the economy. And I'm very determined that there's one thing we're not going to do is run on the issues that the Liberals are going to throw at us. And we're going to stop. It's gotten to the point where I'm convinced now that conservatives are the most generous political party in the world. They go into election campaigns, they actually give it away to the Liberals. The Liberals don't win campaigns, we lose them, and we give it to them. But can we agree on one thing, on the whole issue? They will trot it out again. I guarantee you this will be an issue. They will want to make this an issue because that is exactly the way that they operate in a campaign. So all of us agree on what the main problem is in terms of guns. Please, let's focus on the things that we believe in as opposed to responding to our adversaries' taunts. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I'll let you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charest. I'm going to introduce our next candidate here. Scott Aitchison was born in Huntsville, Ontario. At the age of just 21, he was elected to the council of his hometown and served in different municipal offices until being elected the mayor of Huntsville in 2014. During this time, he worked in real estate and in consulting. Since being elected to the House of Commons in 2021 as a Conservative, he was appointed the Shadow Minister of Labor for the official opposition. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Scott Aitchison.
Good job, as always.
Run.
Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay.
I had to shake hands with Jean Charest.
I think he
It's
drank
a
that
big
water.
deal.
I think he was drinking from that.
You got over COVID, eh? I can just drink out of that one? You're good? Okay, good.
Scott, thanks for joining us. I think it's fair to say, you know, you might not be the most known of the candidates. So I think part of what this is trying to help people get to know you.
Scott, nice to meet you all.
Say hi, Scott. Sounds like an AA meeting. Great.
As this campaign began, I think it's probably safe to say that nobody knew me outside of Perry Sound Muskoka, but that's changing rapidly.
So you might not be that well known, but you do have a long history in local politics, and it's often said but seldom understood that local politics is where things actually happen. It actually affects people's lives the most. So you've been on council a long time. You've been the mayor of Huntsville. You've made the trek out here to Calgary to make the case for getting the support of Western conservatives. What is it that you are offering Western voters that none of the other candidates are right now?
In a short sentence, it's years and years of experience of getting things done, solving problems, fixing things, actually focused on changing things for the better for people without any Ottawa baggage. Ottawa is a broken place. John made that point very well, I think, that the partisan political rancor that goes on there is disgusting. And that was probably one of the first things I noticed when I got there, that I just simply could not believe the penchant for, you know, just the next great line that'll play well on your Twitter feed versus actually solving problems and focusing on getting things done for Canadians. And so I think Canada's ready for some small town mayor who actually focuses on doing things. Things like the housing crisis that exists in our country. It's everywhere. These Liberals have promised billions and billions and billions of dollars, literally over the last 7 years, and have not solved the problem. They haven't moved the needle. The CMHC has made that very clear. They haven't moved the needle. They've never got anything done.
I appreciate that, but my question is more geared to the West specifically. I mean, it's a big country. It's very diverse, and we hardly agree on what the time of day is sometimes. But it's the Western Standard debate. We're trying to we're holding this because we want to focus on Western issues. And obviously, these things have national resonance.
Right.
National issues are often Western issues. Western issues are national issues. But speaking more to Western issues, and you can define that broadly. But what is it you're offering to Westerners, kind of addressing some of the concerns that are maybe more acute here to Albertans, Saskatchewans? I always have trouble calling them, and British Columbians.
Right.
You want to address, you know, their more specific concerns. What is it you're offering that others aren't?
Yeah, I think that's part of, I guess, what I offer is that I'm not an Ottawa-centric guy. I'm actually just a small town mayor. One of the first things I did when I became a federal member of Parliament is the first trip I was able to do, keeping in mind that COVID had started, is I came to Calgary. I came to visit my colleague Tom Kimmich, came to visit Greg McLean, and I wanted to, you know, visit and learn more about what's going on here. And I was surprised and dismayed, I guess, at the number of people that said, sorry, you're from Ontario? And what are you doing here? You know, they just didn't get it. They said, people in Ontario don't care about us. And that's fundamentally what I think we need to change. I do care very much about what goes on here in Alberta. Alberta is the economic engine of our country. And I think Albertans are tired of feeling used. And that's the kind of leadership that I bring. I'll be here and in making sure that I run an inclusive, engaged, and involved government that includes all parts of the country, especially the West.
So let's talk about that specifically. Equalization is a huge issue in Alberta, and it's increasingly an issue in British Columbia and Saskatchewan, maybe less so in Manitoba. Maybe I've missed it, but I haven't heard you make any proposals around equalization. Forgive me if I have missed it.
Mm-hmm.
Alberta held a referendum last fall to abolish equalization from the Constitution. It was a pretty resounding majority, despite some problems with the government at the time. How do you respond from the demand of a large majority of Albertans to abolish equalization? You're in the Prime Minister's chair. How are you responding?
Yeah, I think it'd be tough to abolish equalization. It's one of the founding principles of why the provinces got together and created this federal government in the first place.
Well, actually, I believe it was added to the Constitution in the 1930s.
There-
I don't mean to be pedantic, but it wasn't always there.
But in fact, an equalization formula started almost instantly. One of the reasons the provinces came together to create this federal government was to help, frankly, with some of the issues related to debt. The federal government was born with $75 million of the $80 million worth of debt that the provinces had. It was created in part to help, ease the burden and spread some of the wealth. So it exists. But the problem is, of course, you've got generation after generation of federal governments and politicians that are constantly trying to buy votes in different parts of the country, and they use the equalization formula and they play around with it, and it's been changed over and over and over again to buy votes where they want to buy the votes. And this is, frankly, the problem with our federalism. Jean spoke to it, I think, very well about the fact that the provinces actually run this country. They do. And it was designed that way. I think it's time for us to get back to how the founders actually envisioned this country in the first place. And so I say, yes, we need to meet with all the premiers, but we need to take a look at that equalization formula and bring it back into how it was envisioned initially. No more special deals. This is one area where I actually disagree with my friend Jean Charest. It's time for the special deals is over. No more special deals for Quebec. Albertans don't want a special deal. They just want a fair deal that everybody gets the same deal. That's what I fight for.
All right. I think, I know I'm paraphrasing, but Ernest Manning, who was the premier of Alberta for many, many years with the social credit, hey, we got a fresh water for you. He,
a big one too.
He was around when they were putting the equalization formula together, and I recall he said something along the lines of, the premiers were told, just said, here's how much we want. Ottawa, just go find a formula to make it happen. And it's been a very Byzantine formula the entire time. I think
it doesn't make any sense.
probably less than, even those of us who think we understand it probably don't entirely. It's quite complicated. Your campaign is really focused on trying to unite Conservatives and have maybe a more civil discussion. But in trying to be the nice guy, your campaign maybe carries a risk of being the Switzerland candidate, caught between the big guys, trying to bring everyone to peace. And that maybe carries the risk of maybe being lost in the noise between maybe the different kind of polar opposites within the campaign. How do you stand out from the other candidates on the big issues that have largely defined this campaign?
I think the fact that I've actually focused on the issues very specifically. I think some of the other campaigns have focused on each other, and I've focused on issues very specifically and come up with specific ideas to solve those problems. Whether it's the housing crisis, I've come up with very specific policy proposals. I actually understand it pretty well, having done the real estate business and been a municipal politician. I know it well. I've come up with some very specific policy proposals on addressing some of the sacred cows that exist in our system, like supply management. I think it's time for us
a question on that
to move away from that system.
That's my favorite.
It's time for us to move away from that system. I think it's going to be chipped away at every new trade deal we do. And it's time for us to actually be honest with ourselves and say we need to create new markets, which again is another one of the reasons we created this federal government, to create new markets for our world-class dairy products around the world and create some competition because we have to make food more affordable for Canadians. It's getting tougher and tougher to feed our families. Inflation's out of control. So I'm putting together this very specific policy proposal. I'm not talking about the other candidates. I'm talking about ideas that actually are solutions to problems.
Okay, well, I had that as my last question if we had time. We're going to go straight to that one now. Those who know me know that it's a real, it might not be the biggest, most pressing political issue in Canada, but I think it's difficult for Conservatives to look someone in the eye and say, I believe in free enterprise, except for this entire section of the economy that should be run along Soviet lines. But it's obviously fraught with political risk. It's obviously had impact on previous Conservative leadership campaigns. I think this issue, unless I'm missing something from the other candidates, I think you perhaps stand alone. Maybe we missed something with Roman before.
Roman, I think, is
Roman, I think, is actually mentioned on the Corey Morgan show as well. Why do you believe the Conservatives have to get around this issue, supply management in particular? Because it is probably the most powerful lobby in Canada. It is extremely able to, it can exert its influence on the pressure points in Canadian politics. And you're obviously, you're playing with fire doing it, but I think it's clearly something that needs to be addressed. Why do you think Conservatives need to address it?
Well, I think individual Canadians' voices should matter more than the lobbyists, for starters, and that needs to change. But I think this is one of those issues that it's as I call it a sacred cow. But it is because of the lobbyists, and it is because they've created this system that provides stability. I understand that, provides security, and they like that. There's no question about that. But I haven't tried to demonize farmers either. I think our farmers have done an amazing job of creating a system where they produce literally world-class products within a system that is flawed. And I'm not suggesting for a second we throw farmers to the wolves either. I'm thinking we need to transition away. We need to create new markets, and we need to do it in a rational, responsible way. And it won't be cheap, but it's something that we have to do, because I think that it's also important to introduce competition into the market as well. Because frankly, I think the biggest issue that Canadians face across this country right now is an affordability crisis, and we need to make food cheaper.
As I was talking about with Mr. Charest, from 2020 to 2022, we've had a long series of lockdowns from the provinces, mandates federally and provincially. It has hugely divided Canadians, but it has especially divided Conservatives. It has been, left-leaning parties have generally not had the kind of party discipline issues and unity issues the parties on the center right and the right have. Because it's been framed by many, and I have to admit, me too, as very much a lot of authoritarianism coming in. And so it divides Conservatives, sometimes along traditional conservative and libertarian lines. You've portrayed yourself as someone able to unite Conservatives and find compromise that, comes from experience in municipal politics. But this issue is probably a little less maybe prone to compromise. One side sees the other as maybe racist, sexist, anti-science, and selfish, and the other side sees the other as heartless, cold, authoritarian. And so there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for compromise on something that has become so incredibly polarizing. Do you believe you'd be able to find a satisfactory compromise on this kind of issue that would be able to keep Conservatives together, where perhaps Aaron O'Toole and Jason Kenney could not?
Yeah, and I think, and this is where it has to begin. And this is part of the problem with our politics overall for several generations now. But I think one of the reasons why this became such a difficult issue is because Justin Trudeau turned it into an issue that way. He chose to demonize Canadians who chose not to get vaccinated to try to win votes with those who are vaccinated. That's disgusting. It should never have happened. But that's how our politics works in this country. We seek to capitalize as politicians on the differences of opinion that exist, whether it's East versus West, urban versus rural, vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and demonize people. So to me, that's something that should never have happened. It's something that I would never to operate. As a prime minister, I believe that it's time to start calling this country together, all the things that do unite us. The other issue here too, though, is that when it came to this issue, I think Mr. Charest spoke about this very well also. Nobody had a playbook. We didn't really know what we were facing. And I think it's important for us to remember that freedom is absolutely fundamental to our society. But with freedom comes responsibility. And so in my mind, thank you, what I said about COVID all along has been this: I trust my doctor. I trusted him when he told me I needed to have surgery. I trusted him when he said, you need to get this vaccination. Okay. But I also respect the rights of other Canadians to choose their medical choices. Mm-hmm. That is a fundamental right as well. And so I also believe, and trust me, I hated wearing a mask. And I am just as frustrated as Mr. Charest getting on a plane and off a plane. I complain about Justin Trudeau quite vigorously on the plane when I do it. But if I have to wear a mask a little bit longer to respect your choice not to get a vaccination, then I'm prepared to do that. And I think we should all be prepared to do that, to respect your choice and make sure that we get through something like a pandemic that we don't entirely understand, and make sure that we get through it. Mr. Charest also made the very good point about our healthcare system. And this is another one of those areas of federal responsibility where we created a system in the 60s predicated on a promise where the federal government will pay 50% of the cost, and we've promptly never lived up to that promise. We have a broken healthcare system, and we wear it as this badge of honor like we have the best system in the world, and it simply is not. And the federal government needs to stop meddling in provincial affairs, promising to pay 50% of the costs, and get back to the job that it was created for in the first place, like creating new markets for our dairy products, like focusing on spending 2% of GDP.
I'm going to follow
on
your
first-
side.
Yeah.
I want to follow your sidewinder here, and onto healthcare here. Would you be, would you be willing to amend the Canada Health Act to allow private delivery of services with or without the single payer system?
Absolutely, 1,000%. That needs to happen. In fact, we need to drive more private delivery of services into the single payer system to create those efficiencies. Ontario did a reasonably good job of creating some efficiencies within their system through their funding formula that drives. Basically, the funding formula is driven by volume, and so that's driven some efficiencies into the system. But we need more of that, and we need more private care. And frankly, the federal government needs to pony up its share of what it promised to share in the first place, which is never done. And so if we did that, then the provinces wouldn't be facing fiscal unsustainability either. So it needs to be reopened, and the federal government needs to come to the table with its promised share to make sure that we have a system that doesn't have to be locked down to save it, like we did through this COVID-19 business.
So right now, the boundaries of the seats in the House of Commons are being redrawn and redistributed based on population changes. The Bloc Québécois put forward a motion that would override the legislated formula that would give Quebec an extra seat that its shrinking population does not warrant. This comes at the direct expense of provinces that are growing in population like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
All of the parties, except for the Conservatives, voted pretty much all for this. The Conservatives, however, were divided. I did a little research on this. I think you voted against it.
I was one of the few that voted against it. Absolutely.
I want you to maybe explain why you did that, because the Conservatives were divided pretty sharply along those lines. Why did you vote against that? Obviously, it's going to be a popular vote to vote against that here in Alberta, but tell us about it.
It's another example of special deals for different regions of the country. Either we believe in representation by population, or we don't. I believe in representation by population. I used to have this argument when I was the mayor of Huntsville. In Muskoka, it's a region of lakes and really, very outrageously expensive cottages that exist on waterfront properties. And the townships always felt like they paid the biggest freight, and so they should have more votes. And I said, well, that's representation by wealth. I don't agree with that either. Representation by population, full stop.
All right. After that softball, I'm going to give you a little tougher here.
Okay.
Canada's not run a balanced budget since 2008. Under both Liberal and Conservatives governments, we've run a long stream of deficits. They're now just much larger, wildly out of control. The last election, however, the Conservative Party under Erin O'Toole did not run on a balanced budget. They paid some kind of lip service to it, but there was nothing even vaguely representing a credible plan to return to balanced budget in any kind of realistic time frame. As Prime Minister, would you balance the budget within your first term? And if so, what are the key action items you would take to get there?
The answer is a guarded yes. I think it's absolutely possible. I think it's possible. It would be possible to balance it now. The economy is firing on all cylinders, and yet this Liberal government borrowed another, $50 billion because they think they need to stimulate the economy. In fact, it probably could be balanced within that first mandate based on what's going on in this country. There's no question that this government, this current Liberal government, has borrowed way too much money. But it's also important to acknowledge that there's good debt and bad debt. If we're borrowing to invest to grow the economy, that's one thing. But this government just spends recklessly and continues to grow the federal public service with reckless abandon. And honestly, we need some smart fiscal managers to rein in the spending and focus on the core responsibilities the federal government was created for.
Now, the economy is firing pretty hot right now, but the deficits are so massive that it's unlikely that economic growth alone is going to get us there. Yeah. I think it's fair to say there's going to need to be, perhaps even beyond spending restraints, some spending cuts, because we're spending more now, we're borrowing more now than we have, and even at the highest point of the Second World War or the First World War, it's at record levels. Are you prepared to cut spending if necessary to get there? And if so, what are some of the significant items that you would put on the block?
Well, I think in what is now an over $400 billion budget, there's lots of room to trim, not cut, to rein spending in. And I
This is
would
Calgary. We
absolutely do
want
that.
cut.
Yeah, well, I get that. But I couldn't tell you what I would cut, other than I would say we need to trim in a lot of areas. The Liberal government has grown the federal civil service outrageously so, and we need to rein that in. There's no need to have the bureaucracies we have. And again, I come back to this issue of, if we were to live up to the original promise on our healthcare spending, we could get out of an awful lot of other businesses that we meddle in the provincial responsibilities now, and we wouldn't need bureaucracies to try to manage what we're trying to do in provincial jurisdiction. Think about how many bureaucrats there are between the provinces and the federal government to determine how much money the federal government is giving the province, whether the province got enough money, and whether this was done right. So they have to go back to the bureaucracy here for this, and back and forth, back and forth. The fact is, bureaucracies giving money back and forth to each other costs us billions. Let's just stop that.
I want to make sure I understand something you said. Are you proposing that the original Canada Health Act and the agreement with the provinces was 50-50? We're obviously nowhere near that. But for Ottawa to meet that obligation, which it was supposed to from the 60s, Pearson, that would be a massive increase in federal spending. If I understand you correctly, were you saying that the federal government should be paying 50-50?
And I think that would be part of the discussion. Absolutely. I think that if we did that, then the provinces could afford to deliver all the other services that we meddle in now. We could get out of all those other businesses. Right now, there's no reason for the federal government to be involved, funding over here for this social program, funding for that, funding for education. We fund all these different little areas, and it's a constant fight about how much we give. If we focused on the original promise and renegotiated the Canada Health Act, and we could eliminate huge swaths of a federal bureaucracy meddling in provincial affairs.
So I want to kind of bring it back to more specifically Western issues right now. Alberta last fall, in addition to the equalization referendum, we had municipal elections and a Senate election. Every once in a while, the rest of Canada kind of cocks its head sideways and says, what the heck is that? We had a Senate election, and to the surprise of everyone, 3 Conservatives won. Now, it's been the long-standing policy of Conservative prime ministers going back to at least the later part of Brian Mulroney, when we were in the kind of the middle of Meech Lake and Charlottetown, that they would appoint provincially elected senators, or senators in waiting, if you call them what you will. My question is two-part. One is, would you honor that if you're prime minister? Would you appoint elected Alberta Conservatives to the Senate? And second, and I know this is a bit of a Pandora's box here, would you entertain the idea of more fundamental Senate reform? Right now, Alberta, with the population of greater than all 4 Atlantic provinces combined, has less seats than just New Brunswick or just Nova Scotia. It's quite the opposite of representation by population. It's like the inverse of how much money you pay is the seats you get. It doesn't really make much sense. It's almost medieval. But I understand that's a constitutional Pandora's box. So two parts of that question.
It is. I'd be inclined to honor the elections. I haven't given it a lot of thought because it is a quagmire. And I think, Stephen Harper tried his level best to reform it and really didn't get very far with it. And so, constitutional discussions in this country are difficult, and Mr. Charest's got the scars on his back to prove it.
If I had time, I was going to ask him that one too.
And so it is a difficult thing. I think that I would focus more on, fixing the things that you can fix, as opposed to tackling issues like that take you down a rabbit hole and you don't ever get solved.
So major Senate reform would be more or less off the table, which is, I think, a fairly standard position because it is a quagmire. But appointing elected senators to the Senate, that is something.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to support that. Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else you want to leave us with before we're done? You're actually so good at answering questions. I didn't have to bring it back to it.
My campaign team tells me, stop answering questions, focus on your own issue. Well, no, I don't really have anything else to say other than I've really enjoyed this very much. I appreciate the opportunity. I've enjoyed getting to know my fellow candidates better. I've enjoyed getting to know Canadians and Conservatives across the country better. And I'm proud of what we're doing. And I'm looking forward to continuing right through till September the 10th.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank
and
you.
Good luck on the campaign trail.
Thanks. Appreciate it. I'll take that with me.
Our next candidate is Roman Baber. Roman Baber is a relative newcomer to politics, but he has come out of the gate like a stampede bucking horse. He was born far behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet Union. When he was 8 years old, he and his family emigrated to Israel and then to Canada when he was 15. He made his career as a lawyer before winning a seat in the Ontario legislature as a progressive conservative in 2018. But when COVID-19 hit our shores in 2020, governments across Canada began a series of lockdowns and other restrictions on liberties that shocked many, few more than Mr. Roman Baber. He became an outspoken critic of his own government's policies, something that earned him an expulsion from the Ontario Progressive Conservative Caucus by that province's Premier Doug Ford. Since then, Mr. Baber has taken his fight national and thrown his hat into the ring for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Roman Baber.
Thank you.
For the record, I told him to bring a hat. But as Calgary, Alberta politicians will know, it's important to put it on the right direction.
You don't like the look?
Oh, no, that was a Rachel Notley joke. No, it's not about you. All right. Well, hardy har. Thanks for joining us. Western tensions, we have a lot of tension with Quebec. It gets a lot of attention, as I discussed with Mr. Charest. But a secret you're going to find here at the Stampede is the ones we really got a beef with is Toronto. And it's not just the Leafs. But you were elected as a member of the provincial legislature, member of provincial parliament to the Ontario legislature, representing a Toronto constituency. Conservatives put a lot of effort into fighting for seats in the GTA because that's where the votes are, and they swing back and forth. That's where the elections are decided. And the West largely gets taken for granted. That's Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the interior of BC. The part of BC we consider part of the West, except for the westernmost part. Why should Albertans trust you as a conservative leader to not take them for granted the way we have often felt in the past?
I think I've been blessed to develop my reputation on the basis of trust. Is that Canadians can count on me to make a difficult decision, even when the balance of the political class will not. And it's well known that you might disagree with what I have to say, and that's fine. That's democracy. But at the very least, you'll always know where I stand. I take pride in the fact that I won a key North Toronto riding. It's exemplary of the fact that Conservatives can win in the city. And Prime Minister Harper understood very well, and in fact, multiple times said that you can't win a national election without making a strong gain inside the GTA, and I believe that I'm able to do so. We have to speak to many communities that call urban centers home, and we have to speak about their issues without fear, whether it's housing, whether it's transit. I think we also have to speak to young people on issues that affect them most, and we have to be willing to speak to new communities. I'm an immigrant to Canada. I've had every blessing that Canada had to offer, and I think that immigrants come to Canada for democracy and opportunity, which are the themes of my campaign. Those are actually conservative principles, and we should not be ceding them to the Liberals. So I think I'm actually very excited about the prospect of leading an election and winning in the cities. But as it comes to the West, I love Canada coast to coast. I think people know that very, very well. And it's now my third time in Alberta during this race. And I'm very, very optimistic that I'll be able to deliver for Alberta and the rest of Western Canada, if you'll permit that to be the next question.
I know you got something to say on equalization, and I'll ask you to hold that, keep that one in the chamber for now. So I want to talk about the feeling of being taken for granted here, especially conservative Westerners, Albertans, interior BC, Saskatchewan. The feeling that our votes are in the bag. You guys could do anything and we're still going to vote conservative. And so as a result, we're just not, we're not a battleground state, to use the American parlance. The GTA is where it's at, and then some parts in around Vancouver and here and there, like those swing areas, they get the attention because that's strategically smart. That's where you want to spend your time and your money in campaigns. but that's really where the focus is. And as a result, there's a big feeling in the West that we're taken for granted. Hold on equalization for a second, but what would you do as a conservative leader to make Westerners feel that that vote isn't just in the bag and taken for granted?
First of all, I think that the best thing we can do to unite our country and heal regional divides is to unleash our economic opportunity, and that means availing ourselves of Canada's natural resources. I think that Canada's natural resources are a blessing. I'm not going to let oil and gas be cancelled, and I'll encourage pedal to the metal on natural resources. You will never have to worry about production or being able to transport your oil. I think all of Canada benefits from Alberta's energy, and so that's something I'll encourage. Second of all, I will speak to equalization separately, but it's well known that I have committed to abolish equalization before the end of my first term and provide a tax cut, a corresponding tax cut across the board. Third, I believe in the principle that all Canadian votes should be weighed equally. The fact that we have close to ridings in Calgary, one in Edmonton, close to 150,000 by population. We have electoral districts in other provinces between 50 and 70, some even with 35, 40,000 voters. And so I think that it's rightful for every Canadian to expect that their voice and vote is weighed equally. And finally, it's the recognition. I had dinner yesterday with a group of folks here in Calgary, and a woman said to me, it's as if they come and we're used, and then they come back and then they punch us in the guts. And I think that we need to speak about the fact clearly that there are not just regional divides, but there are sentiments of separation that need to concern every Canadian. And it's not just taking your vote for granted, but making sure that you remain part and parcel and an important part of the Confederation. I'm committed to that.
And actually, I'm going to come back to those feelings around secession in a bit, but I'm going to let you out of the gate now. I know what you want to talk about.
Mandates and lockdowns?
Hold your horses. Equalization is a big issue here. As I mentioned with Scott, Albertans held a referendum in the fall to abolish it, but it was like a tree falling in the forest. No one heard it. I think a lot of that was perhaps the provincial government was kind of consumed by internal political chaos and didn't really try to do much about it. It just didn't really have much political capital. But either way, Albertans expressed themselves in a referendum to remove equalization from the Constitution. I know you've got a pretty, I'll say bold, some would say brash, policy for equalization. What are you going to do?
Brash is not a term that I typically get described as. Look, I love Canada's Constitution, and I lecture on it occasionally. Section 36 of the Constitution prescribes that the federal government is committed to the principle of equalization to ensure that each province is able to deliver a comparable level of services. So I think that it be rightfully interpreted that the section is somewhat conditional. And the condition precedent that you must meet is that a province is unable to provide a comparable level of service. Well, what if we go out there and we determine that provinces are in fact able to provide comparable levels of service? And what is a comparable level of service? If one province has $7 or $8 a day daycare, that's a very different type of service that another province might provide. And what if we were to go out and say, well, wait a minute, even if we were to concede that someone is unable to provide a comparable level of service, well, why not? And should their unwillingness in develop their natural resources, for instance, come at the expense of other provinces needing to pay equalization? So I know my way around the courtroom. I don't think that we'll need litigation. But what I will do is on day one, I'll invite the provinces and I'll say, look, let's have a review as to whether you're actually able to provide a comparable level of services. If you cannot, then let's work to unlock your natural resources before the end of my first term, because it's time to do away with it. I'm running against socialism in Canada. I think that getting rid of equalization is going to help heal regional divides. But most importantly, I think that we need to turn Canada into the national resources superpower that we ought to be. And ending equalization is an important way to get there.
So let's go a bit beyond equalization is the one that gets a lot of attention, but it's not just that. a lot of the concern is around federal overreach in many things. Anger ranges from being able to keep more money, but putting up firewalls, demands, and to demands for outright independence among some. It depends which poll you're looking at. But last October, we commissioned Main Street to do a poll around support for independence. Support in Alberta for independence was at 40%. If combined with other Western provinces, it was up to 45%. Other provinces, other pollsters have put it lower. I think it depends if you call it independence or separatism. I think it's like calling someone newly single or divorced. It's the same thing, but has a different connotation. So it depends how you ask the question. Either way, there is a significant minority of Albertans who are moving from the West wants in to the West wants out. Beyond your proposal to abolish equalization, what would you do to ensure that the West is in and wants to stay in?
Look, offering a meaningful national conversation. As I've said before, I think many folks, especially in Ottawa, do not appreciate that there is life outside of Quebec and Ontario. And I think it's time for us not to just recognize that there's so much strength in our diversity, but also in the fact that we need our country together and united. We're facing unprecedented challenges around the world, and this would be devastating for Canada to suffer any type of exit. And so beyond equalization, I will certainly look at the representation formula. I think it needs to be simplified considerably. I read a lot of text and I'm having difficulty consuming that text. The only exception I would make is maybe for provinces and territories. I will not have a situation where a territory does not have at least one MP. I think that that's probably sensible. But beyond that, I think that we need a fair representation formula. As I said, natural resources is a gateway, but also I think in the last couple of years, and people know that I've been very passionate about what's been happening to our country vis-a-vis the division that the Prime Minister has been peddling. And at the very least, if we had government extricate itself out of our lives to the extent that it's still much involved in public health, to the extent that it still stirs division among Canadians, I think we're all going to simmer down, we're going to take a deep breath, and we're going to start working again, loving each other again, being kind again, something that I think that's been missing for the last couple of years. I have optimism for the future of our country, united.
So I want you to take a deep breath for this question. Lockdowns, forced masking, mandatory vaccines. I think your fight against this kind of government overreach has defined your candidacy more than any other suite of issues. You spoke against these issues when you were a member of the Ontario Progressive Conservative government, and it earned you an expulsion for it. And I think, I'd not be the only one in the room who recognizes that that was quite a sacrifice to pay for a point of principle. But now you're taking your fight national.
Derek, it wasn't for principle. It was for human lives. The idea was not to compromise lives by suggesting, or if you look at my 2-page letter of January 15th to the Premier, 2021, there's maybe less than a line in there about the economy. The idea was that we have to factor in the toll, the collateral harm of lockdowns into our public health exercise because we're potentially costing lives. And regretfully, the evidence is bearing the case.
So your fight when you got started was provincial, but your national now. Okay, I'll let you guys go. I could just see them itching over there. Okay. You're now federal. The lockdowns were pretty much provincial, but mandates, masks and vaccines obviously are a big part federally. So leaving aside the provincial stuff, because you're in the national stage now, what would you do as Prime Minister to ensure those kinds of restrictions on freedoms never happen again?
Right. So a couple of things. I've enjoyed listening to my friends today about their proposals for the Canada Health Act. And it's good that we have a vibrant race of ideas and we have courage to go places we haven't gone before. That's great. And I do support a reform that would provide for more private delivery systems with a single payer. But at the same time, I will also amend the Canada Health Act to provide that we can never have discrimination against a Canadian because of their medical status, ever. I would think, but beyond that, the fight has not just been about mandates and choice and lockdowns. It's been about the culture, in fact, the political correctness, the radical cancel culture that precipitated this public health exercise. And part of it was foreclosing on discussion, right? You can't just tap your chest and yell freedom. And to those that try to make this argument as simplistic as freedom versus mandates or freedom versus health, that respectfully, I don't think is the right prism. I would propose that we're sensible people and intelligent, and we can have a conversation if conversation is permitted. Freedom is not absolute. Liberty is prescribed in Section 7, but we still incarcerate people if we believe that democratically established principles warrant so. So I didn't say we have to fight for freedom. I said it's up to government the government carries the burden if it's going to engage in this remarkable action of foreclosing on our freedoms. And I don't believe that the case actually warrants so. We knew very early on that 80% of the risk is in long-term care homes. We knew that the virus is considerably more transmissible, making some of the metrics that we're worried about, like hospitalization and death, considerably lower. Let's reassess the risk. Instead, we continue to operate as if we're still stuck in March or April 2020. And so once we actually look at some of the metrics and appreciate what we've learned, thankfully, then there was no reason to engage in this remarkable public health exercise that was so devastating and will be devastating, I think, for generations, especially on our children who will regress considerably. So that brings me back to your question on democracy, which is allow for discussion. And that means I will eliminate all the preconditions that precipitated what had transpired. And that is the limit on our ability to communicate, whether it's in Parliament. I suffered from a deficit of democracy in Parliament, our ability to communicate on social media. I will enter into an arrangement with social media giants to ensure that we're not going to be abridging the right of Canadians to free speech online. I will protect regulated professionals, certainly federal ones, and through agreement with the provinces. And I will ensure that we have free and independent media, because you can't have free and independent media when the government signs the media's paycheck.
So let me ask this next question.
Sure. I apologize.
I'm happy with my segues here. Freedom has been a major theme of your campaign. And so I want to talk about freedom of the press and freedom of expression.
Yeah.
The federal government now subsidizes nearly the entire Canadian media. They can pull. It means now that they're essentially licensing media, going through their content, saying, are you good media, are you bad media? And the government can pull your funding at any time. And I think a lot of journalists who are in that media, they're doing their best, but there's got to be, at least in more of the business side and the publishers, there's got to be that sort of Damocles hanging over them that if they cross some line, the government's going to pull their funding and they're in trouble. And I think that's got clear and obvious consequences. We've now got the Online News Act, forcibly, force certain ranking of government-approved news sources, the Online Harms Act, censoring users, the Online Streaming Act to create taxes on independent content creators to redistribute it to big ones to create CanCon that no one will probably watch. It's a large suite of legislation, and I know it's a lot to take in. But if you're Prime Minister, what would be the fate of these bills and the media bailout?
I will defund and I'll spin off CBC by lunchtime. That's easy. So I
don't think they like that.
But beyond that, I'll go a step further. Of course, I'll end all media bailouts and all media subsidies. But you have to go a step further. One of the new phenomena we witnessed in the last couple of years is the record buys of government, of advertising buys by government in the media.
I don't know where that was. We
We're
didn't,
just-
we didn't get it.
And that's been prevalent throughout. And many of that advertising was also self-serving. And that is not just anti-democratic. I think it's just shameful that we would spend taxpayer money to promote our own government agenda. So I'm going to limit and end. If I may, so as you said, I was born in the former Soviet Union. I still remember there's a newspaper called Pravda, and Pravda means truth, which ironic in and of itself. So they would plaster Pravda all over, and essentially it was a machine for government talking points. And that's what we've been witnessing in the last couple of years. That's why we're in this mess right now. There is no democracy without free and independent media. I'm committed to restoring democracy in our country.
I'm going to kind of come at you with a similar question that I asked Mr. Charest around firearms. In 2020, Liberals banned about 1,500 different weapons. Most of them just look scary. A bunch of them, as I was saying earlier, I was very surprised to learn were not somehow legal. There were anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles on there, but a bunch of them were just regular hunting and sport shooting rifles that were painted black and maybe just look scary, but were not functionally different than that old Woodstock shotgun that your grandpa left above the cabin door. But they just, if it looked scary, it was banned. And now we've got pending federal legislation that the Liberals have promised it's going to come in the fall. It's obviously going to pass with support of the NDP that will ban the sale and transfer of handguns. I think it's pretty clearly a clear step in the direction of just banning handguns, and maybe that'll go further than even just handguns. If you're prime minister, is there any part of that you would not roll back?
I'll roll back all of it. And it's
so I can buy the anti-aircraft missiles.
So I'm definitely going to repeal the regulation.
Yeah.
And I'm going to roll back on the legislation that's proposed right now. Keep in mind, so York Center is regretfully home to one of the highest rates of gun violence in the country. And all of that violence is perpetuated with illegal guns. And so any Liberal suggestion that any of their attempts to, in some cases, even expropriate the property of Canadians would make a dent in crime or any meaningful difference in crime is false. This is an issue that we failed to communicate as conservatives. Almost all gun crime is committed with illegal guns. Instead of penalizing law-abiding gun owners, I would propose that we actually tackle the issue, and that is the flow, the illegal smuggling of guns across the border. The Canada Border Agency is dysfunctional, much like most federal agencies these days. It's got bad culture, it's poorly managed, and it's underfunded. I'm going to restore a culture of responsibility and professionalism in government, and that would include the Canada Border Services Agency. We need to focus on preventing the flow of illegal guns instead of punishing law-abiding Canadians.
Let's talk a little bit about the Senate, as I've talked with some of the other candidates. We have these things in Alberta we call Senate elections to elect senators in waiting. I think it's the only election in Canada that doesn't actually get you anything. It gets you brownie points, and if there's a Conservative Prime Minister, generally there's a good chance they're gonna appoint you. So I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked Mr. Aitchison. If you're Prime Minister, would you commit to appointing elected senators in waiting? And second, would you entertain any kind of broader constitutional reform that would see changes to the Senate? Again, Alberta has a greater population than all 4 Atlantic provinces combined, quite a bit more. But we have just over half the senators of New Brunswick by itself, or Nova Scotia by itself. It is, it's not just not representation by population. It is, there is no logical rhyme or reason to it. So that's a 2-part question.
Yes, to the first part. I'll absolutely respect Alberta's desire to put forth elected senators. But at the same time, Derek, and I think most voters know that I say it like it is, or at least the way I perceive it. And I'm not sure that there's appetite in Canada for constitutional reform, especially given how divided we are as a nation these days, as you need very, very broad consensus. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to have a conversation. I was so pleasantly surprised towards the end of February, where on the Tuesday or a Wednesday, the invocation of the Emergencies Act was on Monday, after the alleged emergency was behind us. And of course, I'm of a very strong view that it was an unlawful invocation of emergencies. But on the Wednesday, the Prime Minister pulled the legislation from the Senate because he didn't have the votes in the Senate. And all of a sudden, a lot of Canadians, including myself, and I'm very interested in these subject matters, realize that we have a house of sober second thought, as John A. Macdonald famously noted, and they were able to make a material difference in the development of our nation's history, as it was about to invoke the successor of the War Measures Act for the first time. So I think that there may be a greater role for the Senate to play. This is regretfully probably more of an academic discussion, which I enjoy very much, but I'd like to have a look at it. I just think that in order for us to have meaningful Senate reform, we need to start healing regional divides. We need to restore the rule of law, something that I think is absent right now from Ottawa. I think we need to reframe the conversation. Like Scott said, if there was just one area of disagreement I'd have with Jean today, is that I don't think that we need a special deal. We're all Canadian. I think it's time to start treating provinces equally. Equalization comes to mind, or the lack thereof. I'd like to have a look at Senate reform, if possible, recognizing that it's very, very difficult.
I don't know if it was Sir John A. Macdonald who coined the frame House of Sober Second Thought, but if so, it's deliciously ironic that he would talk about it being sober. I'm going to have to get into that, but it's a good chance it was
Many
him.
lawyers make that joke after they get called to the bar and go to the bar.
Called to the bar. Speaking of called to the bar, we're gonna be wrapping up here in a second. Actually, I guess we're out of time now. Robin, I'm delighted that you could join us here today. I appreciate you speaking to the Western Standard readers, members, and everyone joining us here. Thank you, and good luck on the campaign trail.
Thank you so much, Derek. Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm about to call you all to the bar too. Mr. Baber, Mr. Charest, Mr. Aitchison, on behalf of the Western Standard's readers and members and those joining us, thank you for coming and sharing your thoughts with us today. When I'm finally done whinging, I would like to invite the candidates back up to the stage for a group photo and to suffer the abuse of the local Calgary media. I've done my best to be fair and balanced here today. If any of you do not think I have been, I invite you to unsubscribe because the Western Standard refuses to accept government money. That might actually hurt. So before I let you go, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that we have this beautiful room here at the Calgary Petroleum Club today, not because we actually rented it, but because I promised them that we would run up a giant bar tab. I'm not joking. This means that if everyone here today doesn't have at least one or two tastes of the hooch, the poor Western Standard will have to foot the bill for an extra room rental. So this being a room of Alberta Conservatives at the Calgary Stampede, I am confident that you will all do your duty to eat, drink, and be merry. Okay. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Have a great Stampede, and God bless Alberta.
Our media landscape is dominated by a few big players, almost all of which are owned by big Eastern and foreign corporate interests, or by the government itself. As taxpayers, we're forced to pay billions of dollars every year to support the liberal CPC. But now even the non-government-owned mainstream media are on the take, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars a year in a massive taxpayer bailout from the federal government. This means that even those few bright spots of independence and free thinking in the mainstream media are now on the government dole, and cannot speak without fear that the government could pull their funding at any time. There are a few great journalists in the non-government owned media, but they mostly work for large corporate interests owned and operated out of Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, and New York. Western voices, voices that speak for the West without fear of what their bosses in Toronto will say, are far and few between. The West needs a strong and independent voice that is willing to take on the issues facing our people. This is why we refounded the Western Standard in 2019. Since then, the Western Standard has burst onto the scene and shaken up Western Canada's media landscape. With a growing and dedicated team of reporters and opinion columnists, we have quickly become the third most read online news platform in Western Canada, with an average of 3 million readers per month and hundreds of thousands of people watching our videos and listening to our podcasts. Our news team is made up of credible reporters, largely recruited from the mainstream media, but who focus on issues that are all too often ignored by the old players. Our opinion columnists fearlessly take on controversial issues that most of the old players are too afraid to touch directly. The Western Standard's mission is to be the independent voice of the New West.
This is why we need to see the receipts. What did you actually spend the money on?
We got some major news breaking at the moment for you.
We're making a big difference and giving Westerners a homegrown alternative to the big, government-owned and government-funded mainstream media. We're changing the conversation.
Now, obviously, I condemn those symbols. I think those are...
For sure, we all do at the Western Standard.
What are your thoughts on that debate?
I think that Tom Clark, the moderator, certainly lost.
There's issues with the current ABLET system run by the province.
We refuse to accept a penny of the big media bailout that has corrupted Canada's once free press. Because we are one of the only genuinely independent media in Canada, we are able to speak freely and cannot be cancelled by Ottawa. We have a large and growing team of journalists with bureaus in Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Regina, and on Parliament Hill. Our reporters and columnists are fearless and work tirelessly to give you straight news and cut through the spin. That is why we need you, the reader, to step up and become a member of the Western Standard. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access, much cheaper than a subscription to one of the big government-funded newspapers. We are reinvesting every penny of that back into improving our ability to provide you with real, independent, and original Western news and opinion coverage. Supporting independent media with your membership is the price of having any media left in this country that isn't on the government take. If you want there to be any independent Western media left, then we need you to step up and support it. Without people like you supporting independent media, all that will be left is the corrupt, government-owned, and government-funded press. We've built something great that is challenging the old media, and we're making a big difference. Together, we can make sure that we have a voice that speaks for a West that is strong and free.